All right. What is history? Um, you know, for the most part, when we look at what history is, obviously I've got some keywords up here. History is the interpretation of the past using evidence, not just names and dates. It's understanding why things happened and what impact they had. However, there's a certain science to it. And I think this is what I want to kind of hammer home. We as historians are trained to try and look at sources dispassionately without bias. Obviously, we all know everyone has bias, and it's almost impossible not to put your own bias into the way that you perceive research or in the way that you perceive historical events. However, we really do try hard to put our bias to the side and understand all perspectives of a specific event. Historiography is the study of how history is written. If you ever take a graduate history class, like the first day, they teach you about historiography. And they kind of force you to read a ton of books that are opposing perspectives on certain aspects of American history. I always thought to myself that this is something that we shouldn't just teach at the graduate school level. I really think historiography is something, if you teach it properly, can be taught maybe even at the high school level. But we should be teaching anyone, that if you pick up something and it is a source and you read it for information, you should absolutely look. You shouldn't take that one source as, well, this is the definitive perspective on this, I'm going to run with this. You should be analyzing and evaluating different sources. The more sources you have, a better, fuller picture of a historical event you will have. But it's very interesting when you study historiography to look at how two different historians will look at the same event and look at it differently. And today, as I kind of introduce this class to you folks, we're going to look at early European colonization, and we're going to look at these different perspectives and understand historiography as a part of this. This is kind of an intro class. I usually did this in my first day with my college students. We obviously, if we're doing U.S. history, really where we want to start with U.S. history is Jamestown and Massachusetts Bay, right? The first two real colonies of the first two settlements in what would be the 13 colonies. But as kind of a precursor to that, we want to look at the first Americans, the Native Americans who were settled here, and we want to look at obviously exploration and conquest as the precursor leading up to the 13 colonies and what will begin with U.S. history. So today we're going to look at European colonization, but we're going to look at it through this eye of historiography. Okay. Now, what I've done is I've chosen two models that really are on opposite ends of the spectrum. And a lot of times, as I said, historians try to have a very neutral perspective on history, something that takes into account different sides. But oftentimes, you will have historians that will have perspectives on either side. If you want to call them on the political spectrum, it's fine. I mean, for the ease of trying to explain the difference between the two perspectives, we could say one is a more liberal left-leaning historiography and, of course, a more conservative right-leaning. So for my left-leaning historian, I've chosen Howard Zinn, who, for the most part, many historians see Howard Zinn as a groundbreaking historian when it comes to more progressive history. If you look at the study of history, the school of history has changed throughout the years, and those changes seem to mirror the political climate of the era. Beginning with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, you start to see what we historians call more of a bottom-up viewpoint of American history. Previously, the perspective of American history was very much the American exceptionalism, the greatness of America, the greatness of our political system, a very positive top-down look at American history. We would always look at American history through those who were in power, or through those who may have had economic means. We didn't really look at those who, let's say, from the labor standpoint, or women's history, or African American history, or Asian American history. That is not something you would have seen pre 1950s, 1960s. In the 1950s, beginning with the Beard School of historical thought, you start to see a little bit of more of a progressive leaning towards this bottom up history. And you started to see among college campuses, African American history, women's history, and other different types of labor history. Howard Zinn kind of comes out of that school. Now, interesting thing about Howard Zinn is he was actually a fighter pilot, I believe, in World War II. And what he says changed his perspective on life was he was one of the fighter pilots that bombed Dresden towards the end of World War II. And he saw the destruction and became a pacifist. And as he became a historian, he wrote one of the groundbreaking works in history is A People's History of the United States. It is a very, if I could say, left-leaning read on American history. I mean, he really downplays the role of wars and power and money and finance, and he really focuses on labor, Native Americans, women, that bottom-up history. When we look at Howard Zinn and what he frames European colonization, I've got a quote here, he frames European colonization as oppressive. The treatment of so-called heroes, Columbus, and their victims, the Arawak Native Americans. It conceals fierce conflicts of interest between conquerors and the conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers. To some extent, and I know this is a supercharged word for everyone, but when I was in grad school, we would call Howard Zinn a Marxist historian. Now, being a Marxist historian doesn't mean that you are a communist. It just means that you look at history the same way Marx looked at history, through the struggle of people. And so that's really where the perspective is for Howard Zinn. So Zinn comes around about the 1950s, 1960s. By the time you get to the 1980s and 1990s, I mean, he is pretty much your leading figure in, I guess you'd call it, progressive history. Now, the other side of that would be Larry Schweikert's A Patriot's History of the United States. And as I understand it, Schweikert came out with his book, I believe in the 80s. I could be wrong on that. But as you would imagine, in the 1980s, which was a kind of a time where conservatism really is on the rise politically in this country, you can see that a more conservative viewpoint on American history would start to have some popularity. And to kind of counter Zinn's People's History, you get Schweikert's Patriot's History. Once again, a very an excellent book, but it really, it's fascinating when you read the two of them. These guys are talking about the same thing, but in two completely different manners and directions and perspectives. So Schweikert presents colonization as a positive force, and you'll see that a lot. Obviously, if you're a little more left-leaning, you're going to be pretty critical of imperialism. If you're a little bit more right-leaning, imperialism, colonization, and then eventually the development of free markets is what has made the world what the world is today. So, Schweikert presents colonization as the English settlers of North America saw the Indians as heathens in need of salvation. They believed their mission was to civilize and Christianize them. Yes, that's absolutely 100% true by the source material we've seen. That was the motivation. Not only was that the motivation, it was the justification for all the things that we'll look at that occurred today. But it's important for us, as when we try to understand, it's important that we look at two different perspectives. Most historians fall somewhere in between. a little bit from column A and a little bit from column B. But these two guys, they went into their corners, polarized, and wrote their history the way they saw it. And I think that's still a very valuable way for us as trying to understand history to see all of those angles. So this leads us to something that I did one of these classes in person for a group, Johns Hopkins advanced education class a few years back, and I pretty much the same presentation, and I got to revisionist history, and man, everybody in the class started freaking out. It's like, oh, I hate revisionist history. Oh. Yeah, everybody hates revisionist history unless it revises it to a perspective that you like. Revisionist history, I know it seems to have a negative connotation to it, but all it is perspectives on a specific topic change over time. And I don't, to me, a perfect example of this is the way we perceive Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus at one point in American history was universally seen as a hero who discovered America. And what was downplayed was what was the result of his colonization efforts on the indigenous people. And then with further research, not only what the results were, but what his tactics were pretty awful. So the way we perceive Christopher Columbus has changed, so much so that we're changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. But here's a question that I have for the class. Does anyone know why we have a Columbus Day to begin with? Go ahead, Dor.
It had to do with the 1960s, as I understand it, and the mafia, and around the same time as making The Godfather. And there was a whole pushback from Italian Americans because they didn't like the Godfather image. And that created the Italian American organization that's so powerful in New York. And that led to a building on. I don't know if the idea was originally them, but a building on. That's my understanding.
That's fascinating because my understanding was happened in the 1920s. But it was very similar. It was basically in the 1920s. In American history, there are different waves of immigration, and one of the largest waves of Italian immigration was the early 20th century. And in the 1920s, you started to see the grandchildren of the original Italian immigrants started coming here in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s when Italy was going through some political upheaval. But those first Italians didn't have a lot of political power, obviously, that first generation, but their grandkids did. And so by the 1920s, you start to see in American cities like Fiorella LaGuardia, who's the mayor of New York, first Italian mayor of New York. So in cities, they were looking for a way to bring pride to Italian Americans, and that's how I understand it. And Columbus became a figure for Italian Americans. I believe it was in the 1920s when that movement started. So does anyone else? Mike, do you have a?
Yeah, I think it was in the early 30s. It was after Roosevelt was elected president that I think it was I could be wrong, but I thought it was partially because the Knights of Columbus had petitioned him to create a Columbus Day to kind of celebrate that Italian heritage.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, my point being is, for the time, Columbus was a celebrated figure in American history. I think now we look at Columbus just in a different way. So I use Columbus as an example of revisionist history. But one of the things we're going to see throughout this examination of U.S. history is how a lot of things that we understood as being the the way a certain event was perceived or the way something happened, perspectives change. And perspectives change for a number of different reasons. It could be something like societal, as society's perspectives change. It could also be, and for you DAR folks, in on the Zoom, somebody found a box of some letters or something was buried in archives that completely changes the way we looked at a certain topic. So that some of those will come up as well. So it's revisionist history. Okay. So when we evaluate historical sources, now one of the other things I guess I didn't say was, in addition to being a museum professional and a historian, I am also what is called an AP grader. I grade AP history exams. So every June, the first week of June, I sit on a computer and for an entire week, I do nothing but read thousands of AP history essay questions. So, needless to say, I know what is supposed to go into a good AP history essay. And basically, what needs to go into a good AP history essay is your understanding of sources and source material. And it's not just the information that's in the source. You really want to know who your source was. There are strengths and weaknesses to every source. And it's not that you don't want to use a source that's got a weakness, but you want to identify what that weakness is. Primary sources are things like letters, diaries, and official documents. Whereas we'd like to think that official documents are a pretty reliable source. I mean, they are created by human beings, and human beings can make mistakes sometimes. So, you do want to scrutinize official documents. Diaries are an interesting source for historians because, especially if you're talking about someone of wealth, power, political prestige, I mean, their memoirs, they know someone's going to read them later in life and write about them. So they're usually very flowery depictions of themselves. So you got to take some of these things with a grain of salt. And certainly when it comes to factual evidence and sources, you gotta take into consideration who's writing it, because sometimes their bias may skew what that perspective is. Secondary sources are interpretations or analyses of history. Okay, and today it's not just history books and journals. You've got documentaries. To some extent, what we're doing here tonight is a secondary source. I'm relaying back to you or interpreting my analysis of history to you. Now, when it comes to AP history, and if there's any AP history students in the class, one of the things that I will do as we get to certain topics is I will kind of discuss how, if I was writing this as a topic for a DBQ question or something for AP history, how I would write that. So there is some component of that if we have AP students in this session. So, all right. Okay. I think what I like to do with these classes, it is now 6:36. What I want to do with these classes is I usually like to break them up and give everybody a little bit of a break. And as these go on, maybe the break's not necessary, and maybe we just end a little early. It kind of depends. But for today, I'm going to go for probably another 15 minutes and then give everybody like a 10-minute break to go get some drink or stretch your legs or whatever, and then we'll come back and finish it up. But so for the next 5-10 minutes, 15 minutes, I'm going to go into some of the history part of the presentation. So from here on out, this is kind of how these sessions will go. Me talking about some aspect of history with a PowerPoint and kind of going over that episode in history, and then having an opportunity, at certain breaks to give folks a chance to chime in or whatever. If you do have a question, make sure I get my chat up. If you do have a question, I do have the chat up and I can answer the chat. But keep yourself muted until it's time for discussion, just in case, there's noise or whatever. We don't want to interrupt anyone else's listening to the program. So, okay. All right. First, the first Americans. Obviously, we're all familiar with Native Americans, obviously being the indigenous peoples here in the Americas. This map basically, as we understand it, and this would be evidence provided to us through anthropology and archaeology, Native Americans were actually Asiatic peoples that some 30 to 45,000 years ago crossed the Bering Strait. I guess there was a land bridge there at one point. So, between the last 45,000 years, between 45 and 30,000 years, there are patterns of migration throughout the Americas, as you can see. And Native Americans, as we understand it, were in various tribes. And each tribe was unique based on their geography. Obviously, if you're looking at the Hopis, the Pueblos, and the Zunis, they were in a warmer climate and relied on irrigation. You look at the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Cherokee, who were in the southern part of the United States. Were more hunters, had hunting grounds, kind of that kind of living. And when you get down into Mexico with the Aztecs and certainly the Incas, you see that over time, Native American society was pretty well developed by the time the Europeans got here. One of the old school history versus new school history interpretations was that when the Europeans came here, that Native Americans were just savages and they had no gods and they didn't understand the value of land. And there were all these criticisms and critiques of the early European settlers, conquerors, depending on how they came. In actuality, when we look at Native Americans, they had very, very complex societal systems. And pretty advanced systems as well. Certainly, one of the Aztecs and the Incas were entire military empires that dominated, the Andes Mountains were where the Incas were, and basically where present-day Mexico City is where the Aztecs were. So, you had all different types of systems. There wasn't one monolithic way of living. One thing that we do know about Native Americans, I mean, there's a number of things about Native Americans that Europeans commented on that made it pretty evident that Europeans just totally didn't understand the way of life of Native Americans. There's two things that Eric Foner, who a lot of my material is based on Eric Foner's work. Eric Foner identified two aspects of the way that Native Americans lived that Europeans just couldn't comprehend. One is the way they used land. Europeans obviously looked at land as a commodity, something that is to be owned, whereas Native Americans did not see land as a commodity. It was something that should be shared. That was a very differing perspective, and certainly probably the number one reason why you're going to have so much conflict is because of Europeans who saw the New World as an opportunity for land acquisition. The other aspect of Native American life is that Native Americans were mainly matrilineal, which basically means it was possessions were passed down through the woman. Women played a very strong role in Native American society, and as what we know of European society, women did not in European society. So I remember when I was in graduate school reading some perspective of an English trader who complained that Native Americans didn't know how to properly treat their women, meaning that they give them too much power. So these are two very interesting ways of life that were very different when Europeans do come in contact. But once again, the major misconception is that Native Americans lived like savages and didn't have complex societal structures, and they absolutely did. Okay, before we get to native, the colonization and the conquistadors and all that stuff, let's look at why exploring the New World became an option in the first place. And we're going to go a little global. We're going to zoom out to some extent. We're going to take a look at what the world was like around 1500. Okay. Now, as we look at what was the known world in 1500, you do have coming out of the Middle Ages, and you're getting into the 1400s and the 1500s when Europe is establishing itself. It's taken a few hundred years to recover from the Black Death and some of the other tragedies in Europe. But while Europe was floundering, the Ottoman Empire was thriving because of where it was situated in the world market. India, China, the East Indies had become a major market for goods in Europe for hundreds of years. Now, previously, many of those goods had gone along basically the old Silk Road from Roman days. They had to go overland, and you had to connect Asiatic markets with Europe. But the only way to do that is you had to go through Muslim territory in Persia, the Ottoman Empire, and obviously the Christian world and the Muslim world are not going to be getting along. So to some extent, Christian Europe depended on Islamic middlemen for their Asian trade. Around the late 1400s, Portugal, which is going to be of all of your kingdoms in Europe at the time, and this title will go back and forth. The main inventors are going to be Portugal. Portugal at this time is developing long distance sea traveling capabilities. They were developing these ships called the caravels. They were very large. They were designed to basically be able to go great distances, and to ultimately the goal was to find another path to India, to the East Indies, and to open up those trade routes and circumnavigate around the Muslim traders in the middle. So what begins the desire for exploration, the need for exploration, is Portugal. And as you can see, there's two lines here, Vasco da Gama and Dias, both looking for a way around the African continent, with Dias discovering the Cape of Good Hope, but then Vasco da Gama taking that one step further, bouncing around the Cape of Good Hope, and eventually discovering India and opening up a market for Portugal. And that's why, as we get into the early 1500s, Portugal is the most powerful kingdom in Europe at that time, because they had established this here. But there is another consequence to Portugal opening up this route. If you notice Dias and how he hugged the line going all the way down the west coast of Africa, what he was doing was, to be safe, he's going to keep land on his left and basically follow the coastline of Africa all the way down, momentarily stopping at ports all along the way and establishing what was called factors, which was an agent from Portugal who would set up these trading posts, which would basically take the form of castles, is what they would look like along the coastline. In future years, these factors, they would call these places factories. And I think, my understanding, it's the first time we use the word factory. What those factories eventually became were the trading posts for the transatlantic slave trade. So to some extent, as Portugal is creating this new, very important, and opening up this very important market, what they're also doing is setting the stage for one of, obviously one of the biggest stories in world history is the opening up of the African slave trade. It all starts right here out of Portugal's desire to open up this market. So Portugal is going to, I guess you could say, somewhat corner the market on the African, the trade around Africa. That's Portugal. Portugal's got that. So now the other European nations, realizing that there is prosperity in opening up markets and finding a way to get to these Asiatic markets, will also start on their own efforts to explore and find these routes. And that's what brings us to Christopher Columbus in 1492. Now, the interesting thing about Christopher Columbus, and a lot of us have heard many, many different stories. First of all, no one thought the world was flat during Columbus's time. It was this, the fear was not that Columbus was going to sail off of the end of the planet. It was that no one knew what was out there. So, I guess I shouldn't say no one believed in flat Earth. I mean, we've got people today that believe in flat Earth, so I'm sure it was, but it wasn't it's once again, it's that schoolhouse rock mentality of history. It wasn't a prevalent thought at the time. It was more the unknown. One of the reasons that Diaz had such confidence as he was navigating around Africa, he could see land the whole way. If Columbus is going to go due west, he's not going to see land. And once again, as we know, Columbus did think, and apparently he thought all the way up to the day he died, that he did land in the East Indies. It's why the name of those he encountered were Indians. But what he really discovered was not America, it was San Salvador. And from there, you're going to have, on behalf of the Spanish Empire, the burgeoning Spanish Empire, you're going to have a foothold thanks to Columbus and his voyage of discovery in 1492, which then opens up the floodgates for all of these other explorers that you see, including the English get involved in 1497 with John Cabot. You got Amerigo Vespucci, Cabral, Magellan. So that is the age of exploration. Okay, actually, this is a great place for us to take a break before I get into the Aztecs and the Incas. Okay, it's 7 o'clock. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the second half of tonight's class session. So I think it was Mike mentioned the diseases as a result of what is the Columbian Exchange, and that was actually a slide that was 2 slides ahead. So Mike, good heads up, I moved it back up. So we should really talk about this before we get into the Aztecs and the Incas. But the Columbian Exchange, what's funny is I remember first hearing it called the Columbian Exchange, I think when I was in college. I don't remember what it was called when I was in high school, but I remember when I was in high school learning history that the way this exchange was presented to me was very positive. They talked about the different crops that obviously came back and forth. Crops that had never been in Europe before were now going to Europe. Crops that had never been here in the New World were coming over here, but they conveniently left out the diseases when I was a kid. And that was probably from the Native American, from the indigenous people's standpoint, the most devastating aspect of there's a couple of devastating aspects to the Columbian Exchange. The diseases that came over decimated the native population. Certainly decimated the native population in the Caribbean, and certainly the Aztecs and the Incas. Although the diseases were weaponized against the Incas and the Aztecs, but for the most part, the unintended consequences was going to be, the diseases coming over. What the Columbian Exchange is, it refers to the massive transfer of plants, animals, culture, human population, technology, ideas, all between the Americas, Europe, and Africa. And all of this occurred after Columbus's voyages in 1492. This exchange dramatically reshaped the world. say that again, dramatically reshaped the world with both positive and negative consequences on both sides of the Atlantic. So we look at some of these things, and the graphic does a pretty good job of kind of explaining this. But you're talking about plants and crops. From the Americas back to the markets of Europe came things like maize, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, tobacco, cacao, which is the chocolate bean, beans, squash, peanuts, chili peppers. Not only did these things become staples of the European diet, to some extent, especially things like tobacco, became a luxury item for the wealthy in Europe. And opened up all of these new markets. From Europe back to the New World, wheat, rice, barley, oats. One thing to understand also about the difference between Europeans and Native Americans were significantly smaller than Europeans. And mainly that was due to the diet, because Europeans had been subsisting on grains for centuries. Just the Europeans were just a larger human being. It's one of the reasons why when the Spanish did come and invade what is Mexico, really the Aztec Empire, the Native Americans were frightened to death of the Spaniards because they were so much bigger than they were. And then the Spaniards were on horses, which the New World had never seen that before either. They just looked like these giant men on top of these giant beasts. It was, they must have been absolutely terrified. But all of that is because of these different diets. Also, the idea of the cash crop, sugarcane, became a major cash crop. I know we as Americans, and we think about the crops that were produced during slavery and the major exports. I mean, we usually go right to cotton, but over the entirety of the Atlantic slave trade and the products that were produced as a result of those, sugarcane was by far the most lucrative and probably actually the least volatile product on the open market as well. Now, when it comes to animals, getting back to this animals was a big deal too. And this is probably one of the reasons of the diseases. As we know, I'm no doctor, but I sometimes will pick up a few things. Being a historian, and as I understand it, almost every major disease in the history of mankind has come as a result of man's interaction with animals. So over these generations, not only did Europeans have a heavier, grainier diet, carb-based diet, they had developed these resistances to diseases. So a lot of the diseases that had wreaked havoc through Europe at various times in European history, smallpox, influenza, measles, malaria, the whooping cough, all of these things were brand new to Native Americans, and it ripped through them pretty quickly. So as these domesticated animals like horses and cattle and pigs and sheep and chickens were brought to the Americas, that's a game changer in and of itself. And like I said, horses was definitely a game changer. It transformed the lives of many Native American tribes who had eventually, over a few generations, began to utilize horses themselves. And we'll see as we get to the Great Plains Indians, 100 some odd years later, their whole way of life is based on horses. So the Spanish bring that. The Spanish bring the horses in. And then getting back to these diseases, as I said, European explorers and colonizers unintentionally brought these diseases: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. Native American populations, which had zero immunity to these diseases, were devastated by epidemics. Some estimates suggesting that up to 90% of the indigenous population died in centuries following initial contact. Now, some historians also suggest that syphilis was actually a disease that was brought from the Native Americans back to Europe. So as we get focused on the European diseases that came to the New World, some historians have identified syphilis as a Native American disease that came back. And as we know, that's a sexually transmitted disease. So you can come up with your own ideas on how that spread. And of course, the Columbian Exchange also had major consequences in the realm of human migration. The introduction of plantation economies in the Americas, particularly for sugar and tobacco, led to the mass importation of enslaved Africans. Now, that doesn't happen right away. Initially, when the Spaniards come in, and we'll look at this in the next couple of slides, when the Spaniards come to the New World, Central America, and the Caribbean, and eventually South America, they want to utilize the conquered Native Americans as their labor force. But what we're going to find is that becomes problematic, mainly because Native Americans, they could put up some resistance, but mainly Native Americans were very familiar with their own climate, their own geography. Resistance is a little bit easier when you're familiar with the terrain. Plus, there's going to be something else we're going to look at later in the class, that there is a shift away from utilizing Native American labor and then moving into the importation of African labor. And there is a very specific thing that happens that will be the last thing we talk about in this class. So hold on to that. But this idea of the transportation of human beings into the New World for labor purposes in these new plantation economies and eventually these new farm economies is also a big part of the Columbian Exchange. So what are the overall effects of the Columbian Exchange? Historically speaking, when we look at this, and if I was writing a AP history paper, and it would be something along the lines of describe the effects on both European civilization and the New World as a result of this Columbian Exchange. First of all, in Europe, economic growth, the influx of wealth from the Americas, all of these new products. See, the reason you do this is because you bring these products over to provide markets and to provide products on the open market. Somebody's going to get rich on this. Whether it is the merchant trader who is bringing these things in, or whoever their investment, who is ever investing in this trade, there's a lot of wealth that is generated. And you start to see, as a result of this, the rise of some large banks in major European cities, and exploration and colonization became a big business. And it was all about products. Obviously, one of the other things, we've talked about the food products, we've talked about, the crops, the cash crops, but gold, silver. Obviously, especially when we get into Mexico and we get into the Aztec Empire, I mean, the Aztecs were filthy rich with gold, but they saw it as an adornment, not as a commodity. So when we'll look on the next slide, when we get to the Aztecs and we get to when Cortez shows up and sees that these people are just covered in gold and their cities made of gold, obviously Cortez sees this as an opportunity to enrich the Spanish Empire, which does happen. There's a cultural exchange, obviously, that occurs. European diets completely change with the introduction of these new foods and new products. And the discovery of America also spurred advancement in science, cartography, and exploration. So it is an economic boom that is occurring as a result of this. The effects on the New World are pretty devastating. The indigenous population, as I said before, was completely wiped out by diseases. There were all kinds of ecological changes as new agriculture and livestock are introduced to the New World. There is cultural blending. Now, one of the things that we're going to look at today and then next week is how the different European kingdoms, colonizers, when they come to the New World, they have a very different approach when it comes to their interactions with the indigenous people. This week, we're talking about the Spanish. And as we all know, the Spanish came in as conquistadors. And if you're not familiar with what the word conquistador means, it means conqueror. And if you're not sure what a conqueror does, it is not, conquerors do not come in and mix in or assimilate with the existing indigenous population. They control the existing indigenous population. And a lot of that means the killing and wiping out of able-bodied men, the taking of women as wives, and then obviously the mixed race component that comes from that. So when we look at the Spanish Empire, as a result of exploration, colonization, and certainly the Columbian Exchange, you see the development over the next few centuries of a mixed race society of Spanish and Native American blood. Now, once you have African, the enslaved Africans coming in, then you have a third component that pretty much makes up the racial mix of most of Central America, South America, Caribbean. When we look at that model, and then we look next week and we start looking at what the French and the English and the Dutch did, there was less racial mixing and more just a displacement. At least the English are very much displacement. The English are like, well, we want to be here, but we don't want to live with you. We don't want to intermarry with you. We just want our own little carved out space. The Spanish are going to come in, take over, and change the whole bloodline. The French and the Dutch come in as traders. They're trying to do business. So neither the English or the Dutch or the French, from a wholesale standpoint, are really changing the population to some extent. Nothing like what we see what occurs in South America, the Caribbean, and Central America. Okay. And then, from a long-term standpoint, the Columbian Exchange, I mean, there's been entire theses and PhD doctorates written about the effects of the Columbian Exchange. Some even say we're still seeing the effects even today. And that is this trend of globalization. One can make the argument globalization as a trend begins in the 1500s with the Columbian Exchange. It connects previously isolated regions and fostered a global trade network that would continue to evolve even today. And here's the Howard Zinn side of this, okay? The exploitation of these Native American populations, the destruction of indigenous cultures, and the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade led the groundwork for enduring social and racial inequities in the Americas that one can make the argument still exist today. So once again, we throw in a perspective from a more left-leaning perspective on the overall negative aspects of the Columbian Exchange. If we were going to look at the Schweikart side of that, it's like, yes, there's obviously some negatives as a result of this, but it does open up the global market and eventually leads way to global capitalism and free market capitalism. So, okay. All right, Mike, how's that for the Columbian Exchange? Good?
Good job. I'm all on that. Thank you.
All right. You got it. All right, next. All right. I used to play a game in my college classes. I would see if anybody could say the name of that city. Anybody want to take a guess? The Aztec capital. It's Tenochtitlan. That's how I've heard it said. Tenochtitlan. Anyway, there you go. The Aztec capital. When we look at the Aztec capital, we're looking at its time in the 1500s. This was what a Native American empire looked like. And it was a very powerful empire. They're responsible for the the conquest of the Mayans. I believe the Aztecs had what was the remnants of the Mayan civilization was under their control. Basically, they had most of what would be central Mexico today. Tenochtitlan is actually where Mexico City is. This is Mexico City. Okay? It was built on top of a giant lake. It's actually quite fascinating how it was built. And according to Cortez, the entire place was built of gold. So here is the story of Hernan Cortez. Hernan Cortez was a Spanish conquistador. He led an expedition to Mexico in 1519, ultimately leading to the fall of the Aztec Empire. Cortez arrived on the coast of present-day Mexico with a small force of only about 600 men, a few horses, and some artillery. The Aztec Empire, which was ruled by Emperor Montezuma II, controlled much of the region from their capital, Tenochtitlan, which was a large and sophisticated city, as I said, built on a lake. Now, Cortez, and this is a trend that we will see as European colonization and conquering occurs. Even when we get to the English and the French, the pattern. Mike, I'm going to mute you just because I hear some background noise. The pattern that we see is, in many cases, these Native American indigenous tribes throughout the Americas are, they're not centralized in a way that they could have put up much of a resistance to these European colonizers. Now, when it comes to the Aztecs have been such a brutal empire for so long. They had plenty of enemies. So when Cortez arrives, he actually sees an opportunity once he gets a lay of the land. He sees an opportunity to ally himself with indigenous groups who were enemies of the Aztecs. Most notably the Tlaxcalans. I don't know if I'm saying that right. It's a Tlaxcalans tribe. It was a little bit more along the coast, closer where Veracruz was. They allied themselves with this disenchanted group of indigenous peoples, and they marched together toward Tenochtitlan. Montezuma had actually thought that Cortez was a god from Aztec prophecy, and was so scared of Cortez as he was coming to Tenochtitlan, he actually invites him into the city and tries to make an arrangement or an agreement. So initially, they opened up the gates and they allowed Cortez to come in and welcome him and his men into the city. However, pretty soon afterwards, tensions would arise, and Cortez would take Montezuma hostage in an attempt to control the whole empire. In 1520, while Cortez was away dealing with Spanish rivals, the Aztecs rebelled, and many of the Spaniards were killed during an uprising known as La Noche Trista, otherwise known as the Sad Night. Despite this setback, Cortez is going to regroup. He's going to build alliances with more indigenous groups. He's going to lay siege to Tenochtitlan in 1521. After months of brutal warfare, and one of the tactics that Cortez perfected that other Spanish conquistadors would use is the use of smallpox-infected blankets that would be sent into the city in order to spread basically biological warfare. And once again, using the spread of diseases, the Aztecs were ultimately defeated and Tenochtitlan will fall. The city was destroyed and the Spanish established Mexico City on its ruins, marking the end of the Aztec Empire and the beginning of Spanish colonization in the region. Now, one story that I want, and this gets to the perspective side of this story. Cortez could not have done any of this unless he was able to communicate with the indigenous tribes that he tried to ally himself with. And he was able to do that thanks to a woman by the name of Malinche. Malinche was born into a noble indigenous family, but she was sold into slavery as a young girl. When Cortez arrives in Mexico, she was given to him as a slave, and she became his interpreter, advisor, and later his mistress. She was fluent in the language of the Aztecs and the Mayans, was able to eventually help Cortez communicate with the different dialects. And she played a crucial role in helping Cortez communicate with those local tribes that were opposed to Montezuma, and also to navigate the local politics. Malinche's linguistic and cultural knowledge allowed her to act as a bridge between the Spanish and the various indigenous peoples. She helped Cortez form these alliances, and one could make the argument she was really the backbone of this successful campaign. Now, Malinche is my understanding of Malinche in Mexican history is pretty much very conflicted. It's complex and it's deeply debated in Mexico. This is a great example of a two-perspective paper, if someone was to write. Some view her as a traitor, the person who enabled the Spanish conquest and the subjugation of her own people. There's a term in Mexican culture called Malinchista. I think I'm saying that. A Malinchista, I think, in Mexican culture is used to describe someone who betrays their country or heritage for foreign interests. So even today, Malinche's name is associated with that of a traitor. So that's the Cortez story and the Malinche story. Now, just south of Mexico, along the Andes Mountains in Peru, we have another empire that falls, and this is the Incan Empire, which was actually from a population standpoint was much larger than the Aztecs, but they were spread out all along the Andes Mountains. Basically, my notes here on the Incas. Once again, the Incas had their own internal conflict. Pizarro comes into the picture in November of 1532. He meets the emperor, and although despite being vastly outnumbered, Pizarro launches a surprise attack. He captures the emperor's name is Atahualpa. He takes him hostage. The Spanish demand a large ransom in gold and silver, yada, yada, yada. The Incas paid it, but Pizarro went ahead and killed Atahualpa anyway. Following Atahualpa's death, Pizarro and his force, bolstered by local indigenous allies who opposed the Incas, marched on the Inca capital of Cusco. In 1533, the city fell, marking the collapse of the Inca Empire. Pizarro then established Lima as the new capital of Spanish Peru, solidified Spanish control over the region, and similar to the conquest of the Aztecs, aided by European diseases like smallpox in blankets, thrown into siege areas, and this also helped to devastate the population. So we see in both situations comparisons between the fall of the Inca Empire, the Aztec Empire, was as a result a loss to a militarily more advantageous foe who used division and the Incas and the Aztecs' own allies against them, and utilized basically biological warfare in order to get done. So that is basically Pizarro and Cortez. Now, as we look at this map and we see some of the other notable explorers, Ponce de Leon, Coronado. Now, all of these men had a very similar MO to Cortez and to Pizarro. They would initially try to make initial diplomatic outreach to Native American tribes, to Native American leaders, only to turn on them and use their military might in order to conquer all of these indigenous peoples. So that is basically the span in a nutshell. That is the Spanish conquest and exploration in the New World. And one thing I want to talk about what's going on in the New World is once they established their empire, they set up what is called a caste system. And the caste system in the Spanish New World was very intriguing because it's almost completely based on what kind of blood you have. If you were 100% Spaniard, if you are someone who came over from Spain, established yourself, you're at the top of the pecking order. You're basically a peninsular, meaning you were born of 100% Spanish blood. If you were 100% Spanish blood, but you were born in the New World, this is where we get the term Creole from. And the term Creole is actually a word that would be used well into the 1700s to describe someone who was born in the New World. You were Creole. It actually begins as a Spanish term and obviously becomes part of French descriptions later on. If you were mixed race, you were lower on the social scale and you were called a mestizo. You were half Native American, half Spanish. And then and on the bottom, the lowest rung of the social scale is anyone who is indigenous, Native American, or if you were imported from Africa. So where you are in the social structure of the Spanish New World is 100% based on what your blood makeup is. Also, what was set up were these huge plantations called encomiendas. Spanish landowners were granted control over large areas of land and the indigenous people who lived on it. In exchange for protection and conversion to Christianity, the indigenous peoples were forced to labor for their Spanish overlords, often under harsh and exploitative conditions. What you must understand too is, as much as this sounds very cruel, and as we're going to get to it in a second, it was for the propaganda of the time was that the Spanish were extremely cruel to the indigenous peoples of the New World. From the Spanish standpoint, their justification was all wrapped into two words: profit and piety. To them, they had a religious duty to not only to generate wealth for Spain, to establish it as a strong Christian empire, but also it was their duty as Christians, as Catholics, to bring Christianity to these heathens, to the Native Americans who they were conquering. So to them, what they were doing was they were providing these people with work and with a religious experience, and in exchange, they were getting the wealth out of all this. So their justification was always in profit and piety. Now, when we get to other empires and colonizers who are starting to also make their way over to the New World, and we'll talk a little bit about this next week, but the French and the Dutch are coming in. We can see that the Dutch are setting up right around where New York is, and the French are all throughout Canada and into the Great Lakes area. They're coming in completely different from the way the Spanish are. They're not coming in as conquistadors or conquerors. They're coming in as traders. The French and the Dutch realize that what they want out of the New World is actually to get pelts, fur, because there is a huge market, especially with the Russians, for fur and for pelts. So for them, it's all about trading with Native Americans, setting up trading posts, setting up trading alliances. There was some mutual respect. So what you see is three different colonizing nations, three different approaches to colonizing in and of itself. Now, this gets us back to, this is something else. Let me touch upon this real quick. We'll get back to the Spanish in a second. This is the writing of Henry Kerr, who is he was a political theorist in the 17th century. And you can read here what his take is on the constitution of the English government. But I'll kind of summarize what he's saying here. And the reason I'm giving this to you right now is because, you know, I've kind of given you the Spanish, I've given you the French a little bit, I've given you the Dutch. But obviously, if we're talking about American history, we got to talk about what the English are doing, because the English are, you know, are 13 colonies are English colonies. And I think it's important to understand that although England is late to the discovery game, in the end, they're going to be the big winners here. And the attitude at the time in the 1600s, and it's kind of here in Henry Care's English Liberties, is basically this idea of English exceptionalism. Henry Care was a political writer, 17th century. He was an advocate for English constitutionalism. See, the Magna Carta and the early constitution efforts by England were an advanced, I guess you could say, an advanced political thinking for that time. The idea that your rights are embodied in a document. And the English were kind of leading the way on that, this idea of a constitutionalism, or the idea of a government by law, not by some arbitrary power. His writings were very influential, and when we get to the 1600s in America, you're going to see the early revolutionary figures were very inspired by this concept of constitutionalism. But what wraps up in this constitutionalism is this idea that because they're more advanced politically, that makes them basically better colonizers, because they understand the idea of fairness, in contrast to the absolute monarchies of France and the Ottoman Empire. Care's ideas about English governance and individual rights contributed to the political and ideological backdrop for English exploration, as we are a fairer colonizers. We're not going to go into the New World and do what the Spanish are doing. We're going to do it with some dignity and with law, not with this arbitrary use of power. So to some extent, what we're seeing going on here is the early beginnings of English propaganda against the Spanish, who would eventually be, by the time we get into the 1700s, the English and the Spanish are the two main empires that are competing for the international market. So we're starting to see that the English are not quite are not quite at the top of their game yet, but we see their attitudes towards colonization is, okay, we're better than the Spanish. And that leads to something that historians have loved to address, and that is this phenomenon known as the Black Legend. And what the Black Legend is it's right around the late 1500s. There was there was word that had been kind of bandied about by the English mainly, that the Spanish were particularly cruel to Native Americans. That the way that Spain is conquering the New World is particularly cruel and really not Christian-like. Well, add in a Franciscan friar by the name of Bartolomé de las Casas, the guy on the right on the screen. Bartolomé de las Casas becomes a very, very interesting figure in this, and really is a change agent, one could say, when it comes to the Spanish interactions with Native Americans. But inadvertently, de las Casas also becomes the catalyst for something else. So let's take a look here. The Black Legend refers to a negative portrayal of Spanish colonial practices, particularly the treatment of indigenous peoples in the Americas. It paints the Spanish as uniquely brutal, greedy, and oppressive colonizers, especially in contrast to the English or the French. The term was popularized in the 16th and 17th century, partly as anti-Spanish propaganda by rival nations. The Black Legend focused on the harsh treatment of Native Americans, including massacres, enslavement, forced labor, and forced conversion to Christianity. While the Spanish certainly committed many atrocities, Black legend, some would say, was probably exaggerated or selectively highlighted while often ignoring those very same practices by the English. The English and the French were not completely innocent of their treatment of Native Americans, as we will see in future classes. But this certainly was a low-hanging fruit, I guess you could say, in the propaganda war. Well, as I said, you add in Bartolomé de las Casas. He was I said Franciscan, he was a Dominican friar, I apologize. He advocated for a better treatment of indigenous peoples in the Americas. Initially, he participated in the colonization of the Caribbean, and he even held a large plantation himself and employed, if you want to call it that, Native Americans. However, after witnessing the horrors inflicted on Native Americans, he became a staunch critic of Spanish colonial policies. He will write a book in 1552, I guess not a book, more like a pamphlet. And this was his most famous work, was a short account of the destruction of the Indies in 1552. Las Casas detailed in his pamphlet the brutal treatment of natives by Spanish conquistadors. He described the violence, the massacres, and the destruction of entire communities, called it a betrayal of Christian values. Now, his work made it all the way to Rome, where he played a role in the creation of what was called the New Laws of 1542, which were meant to limit the power of the Spanish landowners and provide better protection for indigenous people. These laws attempted to prevent the further enslavement of natives and improve their treatment. So when we look at this, this is a great example of perspectives and nuance in history, where we can certainly look at Bartolomé de las Casas as somewhat of a hero to some extent. It was after the new laws of 1542 that we do see better treatment of indigenous peoples, but the labor was still needed on these large encomiendas, of these large plantations. So what you basically see is, yes, the Spanish are going to stop using Native Americans as slave labor, but then they're just going to shift to something else, and that is African labor. So de las Casas, this is a great example of someone who, yes, he does make strides in changing the behavior of the Spanish towards Native Americans, but all he does is open up the door for transatlantic African slavery. So one of those interesting tidbits in world history, we call it that causal effect. If we were in one of my classes, I would be telling you all, keep in mind, this is a causal effect. Bartolomé de las Casas did this and led to this. All right. So we're getting close to wrapping up. And what I wanted to do was provide you, once again, I want to go back to this idea of historiography and how two historians looking at basically the same content can come up with two different perspectives. Let's start with Larry Schweikert, A Patriot's History of the United States. Okay, and this is his first chapter. It's an excerpt from his first chapter where he talks about examples of abuse to Native Americans and indigenous peoples. Despite a few glaring examples of abuse, American Indians generally were treated with more dignity and respect than were their counterparts in Central and South America. The English settlers of North America saw the Indians as heathens in need of salvation, and they believed their mission was to civilize and Christianize them. While relations with the natives are sometimes violent, the overall trend was for the English colonies to view the Indians as a group that could be incorporated into a larger, more advanced civilization. Okay? As I put down in the comments, Schweikert's interpretation focuses on the positive aspects of colonization, presenting European settlers as agents of progress and civilization. What you will find in most, I would say, conservative-leaning depictions of American history, you're going to see this very same tone. Yes, awful things happened, but these awful things happened. These awful things led to some kind of progress for our nation. Now you look at the other side, and let's see what Howard Zinn says. The treatment of heroes Columbus and their victims, the quiet acceptance of conquest and murder in the name of progress is only one aspect of a certain approach to history. What Columbus did to the Arawaks of the Bahamas, Cortez did to the Aztecs of Mexico, Pizarro to the Incas of Peru, the English settlers of Virginia and Massachusetts to the Powhatans and the Pequots. The history of any country presented as the history of a family conceals fierce conflicts of interest between conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, dominators and dominated in race and sex. As you can see, Zim frames history as a struggle between oppressors and the oppressed, challenging the traditional heroic narratives surrounding figures like Columbus. As I said, it is a Marxist historian's way of looking at things. Okay, to conclude, and what I'll do is I'll kind of wrap things up, and then I'll stop sharing, and then I'll open up the floor to any discussions we have for the next 15 minutes. If you don't have anything to say and you have heard enough and you want to bow out, I get it. If you want to stay and chat, we can do that. Your homework. You don't really have homework, but something to prepare yourself for next week. Look ahead to our topics on European exploration and consider how different perspectives might shape the narrative. Next week, we're going to look at Jamestown and Massachusetts Bay. And we're going to look at how we've been taught previously what those experiences were like, and probably a little bit more realistic, balanced look at what really happened in those two colonies. And we will continue to look at the consequences between European exploration, the consequences of this contact, and the development of what is this new world and eventually the United States of America. So that is class 1 in the books.